it's fascinating though. Like, yeah, I don't know, this whole thing about just these key people and key places that end up having so much impact. It's
Yeah.
strange. Like it almost, that to me almost rings of some kind of divine intervention, you know, like
but it's happened on several occasions, because he
yeah.
wasn't the only guy to try it. I mean, he got immortalized within the gospel story and became spiritualized with this new sort of pro-Roman, and we'll go into that as to why they did that in a minute. But it happened after him as well. So it happened in the 220s AD, when a prince of Emesa, which was just below Edessa, did in fact become emperor of Rome. And that was the mad emperor Elagabalus, who was the priest of that Elagabal stone, the Holy Grail, the Holy Grail stone. He was the king who became emperor, who took that sacred stone to Rome. But they also did that from Palmyra as well, because one of the cities that Edessa owned and governed was Palmyra, out in the eastern, the eastern desert of Syria, where ISIS have just been blowing everything up recently, you know, over the last few years. But the Queen of Palmyra did exactly the same in about 270 AD. She got her army together, and she took over the Roman Empire from Palmyra. Really? Just from a single city-state of Palmyra, because Palmyra was quite rich, and she took over the whole of the Eastern Empire, and she was going to sit on the throne of Rome as the first empress of Rome. But she got defeated, and so that bid for the throne of Rome ended.
Wow.
So the Jesus character was not the only character to try this little escapade and take over the throne of Rome.
But meanwhile, like a couple thousand years earlier, you have the Akhenaten, if Akhenaten is Moses, and I know you're not saying he is necessarily, but I kind of think
I'm saying he's his brother, so he's close enough.
Close enough. So you have basically this guy trying to take over the world, and he did, because look around, we're all still under Moses's tutelage and kingship. And so it's strange how much of a small world it is. And then the other thing
this does happen. Alexander the Great did exactly the same. You look at the number of lands that he took over and turned into Greek lands. You know, they were all Hellenized.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
As far as India.
And I mean, that's kind of part of the problem in terms of why a lot of the history is been lost or tweaked or misrepresented, is because this whole Greco-Roman we're the best and we're going to bury a lot of other information. To me, that seems to be a pattern where it's like, you know, even currently in the academic streams, there's this still a struggle to preserve this somewhat false, but even somewhat true sort of idea that we are the pinnacle, and we have taken what Rome gave us and made it even better, and Rome took what Greek gave them and made it even better, and Greece took what Egypt gave them and made it even better. So there's like this trajectory where we just look amazing, and it is kind of true, but also not. And I think we lose a lot of history.
Yeah, they were quite amazing as well. You know, they were bolder, I think, than some of our bold moves in recent years. You know, just to, you know, Alexander and a small army deciding to take over the whole world. Oh, well, that's not going to work, is it? Well, yeah, actually, it sort of did. Yeah, with a small army. How do you have that confidence to go and do that? You know, it is quite amazing to go and Hellenize the whole world. And this Jesus character had the same idea. He was going to, in this case, not Hebraize, because he wasn't really Jewish. He was a Nazarene, and I say it's an Egypto Judaism. There was a lots of, hence, you know, the zodiacs all over Judea. These all came from the Nazarene, and this was all straight out of Egypt. So this wasn't Judaism as we know it. This was a very different type of Judaism, but it was sort of Judaism. But this story became very much altered by the victors, and of course the victors were Rome. And Rome didn't want you to know about this story. They didn't want people fomenting new revolts, because they'd already had two. They'd had the Druids, of course, which was only in the 80s, 60s as well. It was just 10 years before the Jewish revolt broke out. No, less than that, probably only 5 years. So they'd already had that one. Now they'd had the Jewish revolt. They didn't want all of these revolts within the empire. And so they recast this story into making this guy a Prince of Peace. And so he was not really Judaic so much anymore. He was a sort of, somewhat separated from Judaism. He was more a part of this simple Judaism of Saul and Josephus. And he was now friendly to Rome, and a Prince of Peace, because Rome didn't want wars. They wanted peace. They wanted the Pax Romana. And so the New Testament story was born out of Roman propaganda.
Right.
It was a Roman propaganda story that they backed to the hilt. So all of these ideas that Christianity was oppressed in this early era are totally wrong. The only people being oppressed were the Nazarene Jews, the Jews of Jesus and James, the more fundamentalist Messianic Jews. But
were the
Christianity,
Gnostics, would that have been
and
included?
they were
Gnostics?
probably being oppressed as well, because they didn't toe the Roman line.
Right.
Rome only had one history of these events and this person, and you had to believe that. And so they promoted it because it was Rome friendly. It was Judaism for Gentiles, and so it was a natural bulwark against Messianic Judaism. It could neuter all of Messianic Judaism. It was just perfect for Vespasian.
So basically they're saying, okay, there's all this political pressure. We need to come up with a new kind of way of thinking, or so let's call it a religion. But it's really more than a religion. It's a philosophy. It's a sociology. And so they basically designed something from scratch and taking bits and pieces out of other kinds of wherever they could find cool ideas from.
Well, they didn't really even have to design it from scratch, because Saul had already made it. Remember, Saul had an argument with the Nazarene priesthood, Jesus and James, and Peter, of course. He had a big argument with them and said that I can't go around, preaching to Gentiles with your version of Judaism. I need Judaism for Gentiles. And he created this Judaism for Gentiles way back in AD 56.
Okay, so
he had already had this in his pocket.
Here's what I'm thinking. That had to have come, I think that had to have come from Rome, because the Jews aren't interested in proselytizing. Why does he care about who, like, going around and...
Because Saul on his first tour had gone out across the Mediterranean as a Nazarene Jew preaching to the Jews, and he got stoned on numerous occasions. So the Jews of the Mediterranean were not receptive to this Nazarene Judaism, but the Gentiles were. But he was too astute. Remember, this Saul Josephus guy is Machiavelli. He was very astute, and he realized that he could, if I just change this a little, I can get thousands of supporters, because these Gentiles seem to like it. Because remember, these Nazarene Jews held a lot of secrets. It was like the Illuminati. It was like the Freemasons, because Jesus was a Freemason. That's not well advertised. because they try and make out he was a carpenter. He wasn't a carpenter. It doesn't say carpenter. It says he was a tecton, and a tecton is an architect. We still have the same word in the English, but in the Greek, it can mean a Freemason. And of course, the raising of Lazarus story in the Gospel of John is a Masonic third-degree raising. It's exactly the same as the third-degree raising I went through when I became a Master Mason. It's exactly the same. So it's quite obvious that the Jesus character was the Grand Master of the Judean Lodge.
So, I mean, if that is true of Lazarus, then that's also true of Jesus's own resurrection.
His first one, yes, because he would have been resurrected in the AD 30s when he went through the third degree to become a master. But his actual crucifixion was a real crucifixion, and he survived that. He wasn't resurrected; he just survived that. And in the Roman record, we seem to have an indication that he always limped after that because he still had crucifixion wounds. So yes, there was a resurrection, but that would have been in the AD 30s. That would have been his symbolic resurrection from the third degree. Okay,
so Lazarus and this earlier Jesus were in a ritual resurrection.
Oh yes, yes.
Okay, so did that involve magic mushrooms or something?
I'm not sure if they use that sort of thing. I mean, we don't in modern masonry. It's just a normal ceremony. But you enact the architect of the Temple of Solomon. So you become Hiram Abiff. This is how far back masonry goes. You become symbolically, you become Hiram Abiff. And Hiram Abiff, who was the chief architect of King Solomon, was killed by the three Jewes who smacked him on the head, and they lost him. They didn't know where he was. And after 3 days, they found where he was buried, and he was resurrected via the lion's grip back to life again. And that's what you're reenacting when you go through the third degree. You become Hiram Abiff. So the resurrection is not even of a king or a priest. It's the resurrection of an architect, a chief architect, because this.
Now that also smacks of well, I mean, okay, the temple is just a resurrection of the tabernacle, and the tabernacle is in a way a resurrection of the tent of meeting, and we already talked about the tents a little bit. So there's some really, really weird stuff going on here. What's your literal interpretation
of the original
Hiram's
temple story? Was sorry, my interpretation of
the Hiram Abiff, like what really happened?
Oh, Hiram Abiff, yeah. Well, he was an Egyptian architect. Perhaps we've got time enough to run through this. I think that King Solomon was a pharaoh of Egypt, because we have this same problem again, that these characters are missing from the historical record. So we've got this famous monarchy, the united monarchy of David and Solomon, who were the richest and most powerful monarchs in this region, in this era. And they are missing from the historical record. Finkelstein and Silberman did a lot of archaeology around Jerusalem, and they say Jerusalem was no more than a village at this time. There was no united monarchy. So where was this monarchy? Well, you've got the same choices we had with the Jesus character. Either you've got the chronology wrong, or you've got the location wrong. Right. And in this case, I think they've got the wrong location. And so what I did is I started searching for a monarchy that seemed similar to the united monarchy. And there is one. It's called the 21st dynasty of Egypt. And so I started looking for a king, because what's Solomon recognized with? He's recognized as the Star of David and the City of David. Well, there is a pharaoh at this very same time from Zoan instead of Zion, Zoan being in the Nile Delta,
Right.
who is known for his star in his city. And he's called Pasiba Kahayanit. My star rises in my city. He's known for the same attributes as King David.
Huh.
And then I started looking around, and all of the courtiers and events of this particular dynasty are exactly the same as the United Monarchy. So things like his daughter, the daughter of David, was called Makatamar. The daughter of this pharaoh was called Makara Mutemhat. Makatamar, Makara Mutemhat. It's the same name.
Yeah.
His army commander of the pharaoh was called Joabinjeb.
Joab.
The army, you know already, yeah. The army commander of David was called Joab.
Yeah.
It's the same name. It's the same guy. His architect was called Heru Matif. It's Hiram Abif. In the Egyptian, and this gives us a better idea of what this all means. In the Egyptian, Hiram Atif means the son of Horus. Heru Atif, Heru being Horus.
Yeah.
And the Joab character, you remember in the biblical story, he was the commander of thousands.
Right.
Is what he was called in the biblical story. Joabinjeb, the name of this army commander, means the commander of thousands. That's what it means in Egyptian. Joab means
I mean, that's
thousands.
The funny thing is that literally in the Hebrew, you've got Egyptian words, and they mean exactly what they mean.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
okay,
of course, Joseph spoke Egyptian. Moses spoke Egyptian.
Right.
Of course, they're going to have Egyptian words within Aramaic Hebrew.
Right. And the entire Old Testament takes place in and in between Egypt and Babylon. Well, what's in between Egypt and Babylon? Well, it's what we call Israel, but maybe that is again
I think they were monarchs of Egypt more than they were Israel. They only took over Israel after they'd been kicked out. So after the United Monarchy, when we had the divided monarchy, and so half of them would have stayed in the Nile Delta, because Tanis is in the Nile Delta, and the other half would have gone to Israel, and so they would have populated Israel at that time. Because remember, Israel is not exactly prime land,
Not really.
If you want to live anywhere, you want to live in the Nile Delta,
Yeah. So I also have noticed that, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm picking up these concepts that in Egypt, we're presented with this concept of a unified Egypt. And I think that in many cases, and you've already talked about the Hyksos, how it was not unified, it was divided.
Yeah.
And I personally am starting to see that maybe it was more divided than we like to think.
Well, it was divided again at the 21st dynasty, 21st and 22nd dynasties. It was divided again. There was civil war between North and South once more.
Right. And so how does that coordinate with the timeline in terms of the Babylonian exile?
The Babylonian exile was about 300 years later, so 600 BC. So the 21st dynasty is 950 BC, which is exactly the same time as the United Monarchy. Exactly.
Right. So if David and Solomon were in Egypt, and then we see the Babylonians taking over the Levant. Is there any evidence that the Babylonians actually made it all the way to Egypt and they were taking them from Egypt, or was the kingdom had expanded a little bit?
They took over Egypt at the same time. So yes,
did.
it was a major expansion into Egypt as well.
Okay.
And so yes, the Babylonian exile would have taken them out of Egypt as much as it would have taken them out of Israel.
Right. Okay. Fascinating. So Daniel may very well have come from Egypt, where he would have been a magician, and straight to Babylon, where he was also a magician.
Yes, where he became a prince, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yes, and that's a very interesting story because it suits that very well, that the princes and the aristocracy were taken to Babylon on the Babylonian exile.
Yeah.
And Esther as well, of course. And of course,
Right.
Esther is an incarnation of Isis, because that's what it means.
Yeah.
Isis in Egyptian was Ast. And so she became Astar and Ashtoreth and
Right.
Esther.
Right.
And they all mean star in the
Right.
Persian. It tends to mean star.
In Hebrew, there's also an asherim, which I believe is the root word of that, and it is, of course, with the I am ending, means the people of. So it's the people of the Asher, which also seems to be etymologically related to the others.
Well,
so it's almost like this foreign group of people, perhaps extraterrestrial. Like, there's some strange
but they
stuff.
did worship Isis, of course, on the Babylonian exile. There was a group of exiles who were not captured by the Babylonians and escaped from Jerusalem, wherever that was at the time, whether it was Egypt. And they went to Yehudia at first, which was a Jewish citadel and temple in Egypt in the Nile Delta. And then they scooted off and they went down, as far as I know, they went down to Yemen, down on the Saudi peninsula, and set up the Sabaean civilization. But they worshipped, and this is all in the book of Jeremiah. So again, this comes from the biblical texts. They worshipped the Queen of Heaven. And so this was a whole party of Jews who refused to stop worshipping the Queen of Heaven. And the Queen of Heaven is obviously Isis, as the Queen of Heaven and the Queen of the Stars. Despite whatever Jeremiah said, they were going to carry on worshipping the Queen of Heaven.
Right.
And so not all Jews were monotheists in this time. And this was in the Babylonian exile. This is 600 odd BC.
Mm-hmm. So not only are they refusing to take on whatever new thing they're trying to push, they're also refusing to take on the Babylonian, and they're kind of sticking with the Egyptian. It's got a Babylonian flavor to it, maybe, but
yeah. And of course, if you go down to Saba, which is where I think they do, I've got this whole section on them setting up the civilization at Saba and the big Marib dam that they created down there and everything else. The goddess that they worshipped down there was Bilqis, and Bilqis is the Queen of Heaven. She's Isis. And so down in Saba, they did indeed worship Isis as a goddess.
Interesting too, because I might be getting mixed up, but I'm pretty sure that Saba is also figures importantly in the Sumerian mythology with Enki and Ea and Marduk and those guys. I think it was the secondary.
I don't know how the chronology, right? I don't know how the chronology would work there, but because under my chronology, and also actually the historical chronology, because they've got a lot of problems with their chronology. I say that Saba was only settled in about 600 BC with the Babylonian exile. So that would be quite a late time
way later
for the setting up. But they were taking their religion from Egypt, and of course you've got all these similarities with Egypt, and of course they would be cross-fertilizing with Babylon and Persia in many eons gone by.
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, ideas and stories are always passed down unless they're buried.
Yeah. I mean, most of the Quran comes out of the Talmud. Out of the Torah. It's a Torah story.
Yeah.
And I say that that Muhammad got his Quran from the Sabaeans, because he obviously got a Torah that is slightly different to the standard Torah we have nowadays. And where would he have got this information that's slightly different? well, he writes about the fleeing Sabaeans because he, have I got my dates wrong? Yeah, the Sabaeans, forget the chronology for a bit, but anyway, within the Quran says the Sabaeans were fleeing from Saba because the Marib Dam had burst.
Okay.
And so all of these Sabaeans were now, at the time of Muhammad, they were flowing up into Arabia. And he writes this story about them in the Quran, about him befriending the Sabaeans. And then he says that they didn't accept his friendship, and so he murdered them all. But anyway, there would be a source of a text that had come out of a Judaic text, a Torah text that had come out of Judea or out of Tanis, gone down to Saba, incubated itself within Saba, and then gone back up into the Arabias to be taken by Muhammad. And so I think he got his text from the Sabaeans.
Wow, fascinating. I had another question that I wanted to ask you, and I forgot earlier, but I just remembered it again. Going back to the Roman and the Paul kind of idea, why would, if the Romans and specifically Paul were conspiring or intentionally doing setting up this new Christianity, this new thing, why did they do such a shitty job of it? Because if you look at the here, what I mean specifically is, why is there such a discrepancy? Why did they allow this discrepancy if they were controlling the narrative on both the Gospels and Paul's later, well, presumably later writings? If Paul was in control of the narrative for the Gospels, why didn't he make that story fit with his philosophy more? Like, because I see a lot of huge gaps there.
I think it fits fairly well, but when you're trying to constrain a real history within a modified political imperative, it's difficult to get everything to fit, and you get some bulges here and there. For instance, Jesus is the Prince of Peace, as you were saying, the pauper Prince of Peace. And yet it says, Jesus himself says, I did not come to bring peace to this land, I came to bring a sword. I will set father against son and mother against daughter, and your enemies will be in your own household. Okay, where's the Prince of Peace in that one,
Right.
So there are many aspects of it that weren't fully controlled. I'm not sure who was doing all the writing, whether the Saul Josephus character was just doing the editing and he already had these texts and he was, sitting there changing them to suit the Roman imperative. But there are lots of elements in there that have not been fully thought through. For instance, going back to the chronological chasm, we all know this is an AD 20s stroke AD 30 story. And yet Jesus is describing the siege of Jerusalem. When he says, I can see Jerusalem surrounded by a wall and a trench, that comes from Josephus Flavius. That's the siege of Jerusalem in AD 68. And yet Jesus is describing it. And they have to say, oh, this is just prophecy. Well, yeah, okay, but it's still AD 68. And then Jesus laments the death of Zacharias Baruch. Well, yeah, okay, well, yeah, and he has this very specific death in the middle of the temple, between the temple and the altar. Yeah, but we know when that happened in AD 68. Nothing to do with the AD 30s. And Jesus mocks Zizit ben Hakeseth. He has exactly the same story as is contained in the Talmud. I use the Talmud quite a lot as well because it mentions Jesus. And it's the same mockery. It's exactly the same. And nobody seems to have picked up on this except for me. And so anyway, so he's mocking Zizit ben Hakasif because of his ostentatiousness. He was a very rich character. Yeah, fine.
So I'm getting the impression that I guess it doesn't matter if there's discrepancies, because you've got people who are going to read the Talmud, and you've got the people who are going to read the Gospels, and they're probably not the same people.
They're not the same people, and that's what they hoped. And so nobody, even the Gospel writers, probably didn't know what that particular set of verses was talking about, and so they left it in. You would only know what it's talking about if you had read the Talmud. But the trouble is with this character is he lived in AD 68, and he was one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt. So time and time again, the actual gospel story is talking about the AD 60s, not about the AD 20s. And so, yes, we get a lot of these discrepancies left, right, and center. It was very, very sloppy editing all the way through it. And you can see the holes in it. They do the same. They were very sloppy chroniclers, these people. They do the same in the Doctrine of Addai, which is another of these apocryphal gospels I use, which has Jesus writing letters to the king of Edessa, King Agbaras. And of course, they change, because I don't think it was written then, they changed the emperor to, what do? They call him Tiberius, of course. They have to call him Tiberius in order to fit in with the standard gospel narrative of the AD 20s.
Right.
But the governor of Syria, they leave as the governor who was there in the AD 50s.
Right.
So the sloppy editing, they obviously didn't know who the governors of Syria were, so it wasn't a concern to them. And they've left the wrong governor of Syria into the story. Right. Okay. And so the emperor is from the AD 20s and the governor is from the AD 50s or AD 40s.
I've seen some articles on that. It's interesting. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sloppy translation. Again, I talk about that a lot in my book, but yeah, it is fascinating that we take these documents that are here that anyone can inspect and anyone can dig into and anyone can fact check, and yet we just believe whatever they tell us.
And I'm just surprised that more proper historians haven't picked up on this, because, okay, theologians, you might say they've only got one story to tell, but a theologian should be more broad-minded. And the one I like about the Edessan story, which just proves that the Edessan story has been covered up, is the story about John the Baptist, which we get from Josephus Flavius. He gives us his story as well about John the Baptist. And he says that, John the Baptist was complaining about a marriage to Herod Antipas. To allow that marriage, Antipas had to divorce his previous wife, who was Pharsalus, who was the daughter of the king of Petra, Aretas of Petra. So, of course, Aretas of Petra got upset by this because his daughter had just been spurned and thrown back to Petra. And so he gathered an army together to go and punish Herod Antipas. This was in about AD 30, something of that nature. And so he marches up with his army. And Josephus gives us this story. And he says that the army of the army of Aretas of Petra was joined by some fugitives from Syria and defeated Herod Antipas. And you're thinking, hold on, Josephus, you know what's going on in this region, in this era. Why do you not give us the name of these fugitives that came and helped King Aretas of Petra? Well, because Rome told him not to tell us. Because if you go to the Syriac historians, like Moses of Corine, they tell exactly the same story. But they say that King Aretas of Petra was joined by the Edessan army and defeated Herod Antipas. And so here we have a complete story about the Edessan army being down in Judea and being involved in Judean politics. And yet Josephus has deleted them from his history. We only know about this because this history was preserved by the Syriac historians. And the other interesting thing about this is, why on earth were the Edessans interested in this particular battle against Herod Antipas? The king of Petra, of course, we know why he was interested, because his daughter had been spurned and thrown back to Petra. But why did the Edessan army come down to assist him in defeating the Judean tetrarch? It has to be that the only other thing, which is actually mentioned in the Syriac record, the only other thing of significance is that John the Baptist was beheaded.
Right.
Which indicates that John the Baptist must again have been linked very closely to the Edessan monarchy. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been interested in this particular dispute down in Judea.
Well, couldn't it have been what year was this?
AD 33, something like that.
Okay, so a little bit earlier than they probably weren't quite thinking ahead to the revolt quite yet.
No, they weren't quite yet, but it was unusual because the Edessan army wasn't allowed to go down to Judea. That was against Roman regulations. They weren't supposed to be down there. And there were only two things that happened for this particular battle. One was the spurning of a wife, and the other was a beheading of a well-loved priest.
Right.
And that well-loved priest must have been linked somehow to the Edessan monarchy.
Right.
And of course, if it was John the Baptist from the gospel story, John the Baptist was the cousin of Jesus anyway, so we know he was linked. If Jesus was King Esus of Edessa, King Esus Manu of Edessa, who was the king in the AD 50s/60s. Of course, John the Baptist would have been linked in some fashion to that monarchy because he was the cousin of Jesus.
Right. Oh, wow. Well,
it just means it's a much more important story than people have been making out. You know, if you just take the Catholic perspective on this story, it's a minor event that happened in Judea, and this particular prophet happened to be linked to God in some fashion, so therefore he's important. But nothing else was really going on at the same time.
Right.
And then you come to the Edessa story, and suddenly you find out this is a titanic battle between very powerful forces, between the Roman Empire and this very, very wealthy monarchy in northern Syria, who only had a very small province, but were immensely wealthy. And that's where their power came from. And it was their machinations trying to increase their power in the region to get a throne to sit upon. I mean, they were linked in some fashion to Simon Boethus. So Simon Boethus was, again, one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt. And he was one of the richest people in the whole of the Roman Empire. And now his daughter, we have this from my research and from the research of Professor Robert Eisenman, his daughter was Mary Magdalene.
Oh.
And she was known as Mary Boethus, and they lived at the house of Simon. And of course, if you know your Gospels, you'll know that Mary Magdalene lived at the house of Simon. Well, her father was called Simon Boethus, and he was one of the very rich men of the Near East. And there are so many links between what they're saying is that the house of Simon is Simon of Bethany.
Is it Simon Peter?
And it's the same character. No, it wasn't Simon Peter. No, this was the generation prior. So Simon Boethus. I don't think he would have been linked with Simon Peter. But the interesting thing about this Mary character, Mary Boethus, Mary Magdalene, is she married Jesus. And we have this from Josephus Flavius and from the Talmud, She married Jesus of Gamala, who is the Jesus character. He was the leader of the Jewish revolt.
That's in the Talmud as well?
He's in the Talmud, yeah. The Talmud tells us that Jesus of Gamala was bought the high priesthood by his wife, who was Mary Bothus, Mary Magdalene. It also says that when she married Jesus, she was given a dowry of 1 million gold denarii, which is worth about $20 billion in today's money. That was just her dowry. These were the richest people in the whole of the Roman Empire. That's why their story is important. That's why they had the wealth to do all of the things that they did to take on the might of Rome eventually in the Jewish revolt, because they were immensely wealthy. And that's why this story got written. It was the story of very wealthy, influential monarchs, not some pauper prince of peace that nobody knows anything about. They were very, very well known at that time. I mean, Queen Helena, who would have been the mother of the King Esus, Manu character, the king of Edessa. Queen Helena of Edessa was the queen of the Jews in the AD 40s and 50s. She became the queen of the Jews.
Okay, so if Paul is writing these stories, that the characters that he's using, this would be similar to me deciding to write a historical fiction starring Donald Trump. Everybody's going to know who this guy is, the real guy, and going to know that my story is made up.
Yeah, but not in just the next generation, because you've changed the name slightly. You have the name Mary instead of Helena. Mary just means the bishop. It's a priestly title. That's why you get so many Marys knocking around the gospel story. In Syriac, Mary means bishop. So the names have been changed very slightly. I mean, for instance, in the Gospels, we have Jesus Emmanuel as being the biblical Jesus. And the prophecy is that Jesus will become the Messiah because his name is Emmanuel. Yeah. But of course, in the Gospels, he was never called Emmanuel. Not once. Never was he called Emmanuel. So what does this prophecy actually mean? It means that he was a king of Edessa, because the king of Edessa was called Esus Manu. That was his royal titles. Esus Manu, Jesus Emmanuel. It was a prompt to those in the know, those who had been initiated into these secrets, that the Jesus character was a king of Edessa. All someone needs to do is give you a nudge and a wink and say, Manu, Manu of Edessa. Oh, that Manu. Yeah, okay. And that's how you perpetuate this history to those people who had been initiated within secret societies. But to the rest of the society, how are they going to know what this story is actually talking about? It's been divorced so radically from where it came from. I mean, that was the whole reason for putting this story back in the AD 30s. It magnificently separated itself from the Jewish revolt, because Romans didn't want you to know anything about this being linked to the Jewish revolt. So they said, oh, he lived in the AD 20s. He was crucified in AD 30. And so you can search for your whole life in the AD 30s and never find anything about this character at all.
Okay, so is Paul a Freemason? Is he going? Yeah. So Paul's writing this book saying, "Hey."
Sorry, Paul. I had a vision of Peter there in my mind for a minute. No, Paul was rejected.
Okay. Well. Okay.
This is the whole reason he started up he became the apostle to the Gentiles and started up his simple Judaism, because he was rejected. They didn't trust him.
Oh,
and so that's why he had the big argument with Barnabas, if you remember.
Yeah.
And they parted company with very bad words, apparently.
Right.
And he started off with Silas instead. And
so
he was rejected.
Jesus, James, and Peter, and that crew were the in crowd. They were Freemasons. they were initiated, and they had their own secret nod and wink stories that they were probably writing down. And then Paul came along and was like, well, fine, I'm gonna make my own secret society.
Yeah, yeah, he was rejected from Arthurian legend, and I can't go into the reasons why I think that there are links here with Arthurian legend, but there are many links. It is possible that he killed his mother. And there are not many reasons for getting rejected from one of these societies, but killing your mother might be one of them. Anyway, he got rejected. And we also have a possibility of the rejection for the 12th disciple. If you remember, there was an election after Judas disappeared. Yeah. And that election, I believe, and it's too complicated to explain here, readers will have to have a look at my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, for that one, I think. The two contenders were actually Saul and Barnabas, because there is a complete confusion of names in the various gospels and the various pseudo-gospels, like the Clementine recognitions and so on, between these two characters. So I think this competition, this election for the new 12th disciple, was between Saul and Barnabas. Okay. And of course, the Saul character was not selected. It was Matthias Barnabas that was selected. Right. And so Saul was rejected. And of course, now he's been rejected twice. And you think, well, they won't let me be a part of their little society. I'm going to start my own.
Yeah. And that's so exactly in this case, history has been written by the losers.
In a way, because he became the winner, because he, having been rejected and having started his own little new simple Judaic religion, he then went to get some backing for that religion and for his place. And of course, where did he go to? He went to Rome and said, look, I'm the guy who should really be on this throne, not this guy over here. I'm the true heir to this particular throne and this particular religion. Can you give me some help?
Right.
And I think that was the whole idea of this, that he had gone to Rome at a very early stage to try and get some backing from Rome.
Okay, cool. I think we better end it here. And this is amazing.
Just in case we go on a little bit too much. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we might have to chat again sometime. Yeah, this is running a little long. I'll probably cut this into 3 episodes or something. But absolutely, this has been a blast. I'm just going to sign off and stop recording, and then I'm going to chat with you for 1 minute more. Yeah, so thanks for listening, everyone. Again, this has been Ralph Ellis. Yeah, I'm going to put a picture of his books up here. They're probably on top of my face right now, and some links below. And of course, to get the full details, you're going to want to read most of these books, because this is such a huge story. It goes from the middle of Egypt all the way to Paul the Apostle, and just the twists and turns are mind-blowing. So yeah, thanks again, Ralph, and thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me again. Cheers.
You bet. Please visit our sponsor, neandertees.com, fashion for the discriminating Neanderthal.